All right, so this is going to be a replacement video for class. I apologize I couldn't be there this week. I'll have more information when I return. Um, but what we were going to start covering this week was basic supply and demand. So it's going to use some of the principles that we'd already talked about, just in a slightly different context. So when we think about supply and demand, we're talking about supply and demand of a specific product, a specific service. And so it's really going to be just what we're looking at is a combination of buyers and sellers. So we call this a market, right? There's a market for a particular product, for a particular service. This could be, Sharpie markers. This could be a dog walking service, right? And so we're going to think about starting out only competitive markets. So this is going to be one where there's a lot of buyers, there's a lot of sellers, so that no one person's decision, no buyer or sellers has any influence over the price. Okay. So this is like not applicable to when you think about, excuse me, like if the government is dealing with one company that's like doing all the manufacturing for its defense products, well, that one company has a lot of power in that market. So we're looking at markets with lots of buyers, lots of sellers. Okay. So we're going to call these perfectly competitive markets. That's going to be kind of our kind of baseline that we compare every other type of market to. Perfectly competitive market, we have some assumptions that are a little bit unrealistic, but we have to kind of have this comparison, right? Like this ideal world to compare to before we start to look at what happens in the real world. So in the perfectly competitive market, we assume that everybody's selling the exact same product. Everything looks no different. So, I always say something like that, like sheets of paper, right? 8 by 11 sheets of paper. That's like, a homogeneous product. Everyone's selling the exact same thing. Um, a lot of other things are really, really close to this. I mean, even if you think about if I'm buying like adapters, right, for USB-C to USB, they're all the same. I mean, they might be slightly different in quality, but pretty much they're all going to be the same good. So we're thinking about homogeneous goods where everyone's selling the exact same product and nobody has any influence over the price. Okay. So that's perfectly competitive markets. That's what we're going to be looking at. We'll kind of start out and then thinking about, well, what does demand look like in these markets? So we're going to make a distinction between demand and quantity demanded, right? So anytime we've got demand for a product, that means that's how much people want to buy at every single price. The quantity demanded is just how much or the quantity that someone is willing to buy at a specific price. So the law of demand tells us that as the price of something goes up, people are going to want to buy less of it, right? So that as you increase the price, the same person is going to want to buy a lower quantity. Okay. So there's this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So we usually write price as P, quantity demanded as Q subscript D, right? And there's this inverse relationship, or kind of using arrows when the price is going up, people are going to want to buy less of that product. Okay. And vice versa, right? If the price goes down, people are going to want to buy more. So, for the sake of this chapter and pretty much what we're going to do almost this whole semester, we're going to assume demand is linear. It makes the math a little bit easier. It also just makes it a little easier when we're kind of drawing things out. And we can think about what's really driving the law of demand. So we have two things, and we kind of already talked about them a little bit, but or at least alluded to them in module two. But the first is going to be the substitution effect, which is that when the price of something goes up, right, it's more likely that I am going to try to find other goods to buy instead. So even if I think about like different types of t-shirts, if I have this one specific brand of t-shirt that I really like, if they increase the price, what am I more likely to do than I was before? Well, I'm more likely to find another brand of t-shirt that's not as expensive that maybe I don't like it quite as much, but it's cheaper, and so I might switch over to buying that. I think about this with like I buy like white t-shirts to wear underneath, a lot of the clothes I wear here in I wear to class, and so it's like I don't really care what they look like. They're always underneath my clothes. And so if this, Hanes increases their price by a bunch, I'm going to substitute away and try to, start to buy a lot less Hanes and a lot more Fruit of the Loom or whatever the other brand is, right? So that's the substitution effect. Now, the income effect is also going to be driving this law of demand, which is, well, even if the only kind of white t-shirt I want to buy is Hanes, I am like my dad is like this. Like he gets on a brand and that's the only thing he'll buy. Well, he's only got so much money he wants to spend on white t-shirts, and so if they increase the price, Well, if he had $100 he was going to spend and the price was 10 before he'd get 10, now if they increase it to 20, even if he doesn't change how much he's buying or sorry, the brand that he's buying, he's only going to be able to afford to buy five, right? So the fact that we have limited resources when prices increase, we're also going to have the income effect driving down that quantity demanded that people will have when the price is higher. So both the substitution and income effect are going to kind of work to driving this law of demand where we see this inverse relationship. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So when we're thinking about demand versus quantity demanded, we're going to depict the demand for a product using what we call a demand schedule. So this demand schedule is going to show us all the combinations of price and quantity demanded that we would see for a specific good. Okay. So I chose orange mocha frappuccinos here. You can kind of think about demand schedule says when the price is zero, well, there's still going to be some upper limit. I'm not just going to want an infinite amount because if I'm having to consume these, right, like they don't keep, right? So I can't just have them sitting around my car. I can't drink 12 orange mocha frappuccinos at once. And so, there will be some intercept. And for some goods, it might be insanely high, but there will be, if the price was even zero, there will be some intercept for these goods. So even if this was like a quote unquote free product, the quantity demanded of this product would only be 12. Now they increased the price to $1, still relatively cheap. People still want a lot of these, but they might not want as many as before because A, the price is higher. I might find other drinks to buy instead, or even if this is the only drink I want, I just maybe I only have $10. All I can afford now is to buy 10 of these. Okay. So the income and substitution effect will, as this price goes up, drive the quantity demanded closer and closer to zero. So every single one of these rows is a price and quantity demanded combination. The combination of all those points, that's what makes up our entire demand curve. Okay. So if I'm thinking about this demand schedule and the demand curve, if I were to plot this out, right, the very first point was what, 0, 12, and then 1, 10, and 2, 8, et cetera, et cetera. Every single point here is going to be a price and a corresponding quantity demanded. The entire curve, if I were to connect all of those points, this is what we would call the entire demand or the demand curve for this product, these orange mocha frappuccinos. So the demand curve is made up of a bunch of different points that include the quantity demanded. Okay. So if I'm thinking about this, oh, I'm a little bit out of practice here. There we go. So let's say I had that graph. Let me see if nope, I want to make this lighter. Let's see if that helps a little bit. Oh, maybe a little bit too much. There we go. So I just had up there, I believe, let's add this intercept and the price at zero was 6. So behind any demand curve, we're always going to have a demand equation. So if we think about any linear equation, it's like y is equal to mx plus b, right? Now our x, what's on our x-axis, that's going to be our quantity demanded, and our y is price, right? So y is equal to, right, I'm just kind of plugging in what our x and y values are. Now, my intercept is going to be the price such that the quantity demanded is 0. So here, where is the quantity demanded equal to 0? Ooh, that's at a price of $6. So that's going to be when quantity demanded is 0, the price would have to be $6. So my demand equation, I can think about has this intercept. And then what would the slope be? Well, I can just use these 2 points, kind of similar to what we did when we were looking at production possibilities curves, right? What's the slope of a line? It's the change in y over the change in x. In this case, change in price over change in my quantity demanded. Okay. So going from here to here, the price is changing by -6. Quantity demanded is changing by 12. So I get this slope of -1/2. So my demand equation would look something like that. Okay. Sorry. I've got filming this at home with two dogs and a cat. So, so we've got here's my demand equation, and we come up with that very similar to the way we would for any linear equation like we did for the production possibilities curve. Now, notice what's always going to be true for my demand equation, that slope is always negative. There's always this inverse relationship that as the price is going down here, the amount that people want to buy or the quantity demanded is going up. Okay. Um, so that is our demand curve and demand equation. So I kind of had this written out already for us. Um, but I kind of wanted to piece together how you come up with that demand equation where the intercept is going to be the price at which the quantity demanded was zero. And then that slope you can determine by kind of plotting those extreme points. Or you could even think about here, if I look between any two prices and any two quantity demanded, notice if I'm going from this point to this point, the change in the price was what? 4 to 3, so 1. What was the change in my quantity demanded? Well, I was going from 6 to 8. So 2, so -1/2. I could choose any 2 points on that demand curve and still come up with that same slope. Okay. All right. So the next thing we're going to think about is what the demand curve is telling us. Okay. So the demand curve, I'll typically write it out as, draw this demand curve and put a D next to it to represent demand. But then I'll also put next to it that it's the same as the marginal benefit because we know that someone will be willing to buy something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. What is the marginal cost to the consumer when they buy something? It's the price. So as soon as the price is less than or equal to that marginal benefit, somebody's going to buy this, right? So as soon as that price hit $4, that was when the person was willing to buy that sixth unit. So it must be that sixth unit, that price of 4 was when it was exactly equal to that individual's marginal benefit. So the demand curve also tells us the marginal benefit of every single quantity demanded. So when we go back here, we can interpret, oops, there we go. We can interpret all these values as the marginal benefit of the 10th drink here was $1. The marginal benefit of the fourth drink was $4, etc. So demand is really going to represent to us the marginal benefit. Now, how could I find the marginal benefit not using that table? Well, if I have the equation, when I say that the demand curve is equal to the marginal benefit, what I'm really saying is the price at which they'd first buy it is when that price is equal to their marginal benefit. So when we're thinking about our demand equation, price is really what's reflecting to us the marginal benefit. So we can think of that demand equation instead of price. We can also think of that y-axis being representing the consumer's marginal benefit. And then if I want to know the marginal benefit of the fifth unit, I just plug a quantity of 5 into here. 5 times zero point 0.5 is 2.5. 6 minus 2.5, the marginal benefit of that fifth unit would be 3.5. All right. So just plugging in the quantity that you want to find the marginal benefit of into that demand curve equation. Okay. So as you do that, what you will notice if I plug in 1, 2, 3, etc., as I plug in higher and higher quantities, well, we said this kind of in the past. If I have more of something, what's benefiting me more, the first unit or the second? Well, if I have one car versus zero, there's a huge marginal benefit. If I have two cars instead of one, not near as high, right? So our marginal benefits are declining, which is why we're willing to pay less and less for more and more or a higher and higher quantity of a good. This law of diminishing returns, right? Or the law of diminishing marginal benefits really stems from just kind of the nature of owning or right, purchasing goods. It's what's going to be driving our demand curve to be downward sloping. Okay. So from there, We now know some things about the individual kind of demand curve. It's kind of declining, representing that an individual's marginal benefit, as you have more and more of something, the marginal benefit is going down. So you're willing to pay less and less for more. For example, I'm willing to pay quite a bit more for the first couple gallons of gas to get around town. By the time I buy the 50th gallon, well, I can't use all that gas in a day. I might hold out and wait for the price to drop in the future, right? So as I have more of something, I'm willing to pay less and less because my marginal benefit is declining. Now, when it comes to the market demand, right? All we're going to do is take every individual's demand curve. So here we had the original person we were looking at, Zoolander. I'm going to add in Ken, and to get my market demand, I'm just going to look at every single price and add up, well, how much was Zoolander willing to buy? How much was Ken willing to buy? So I'm going to add up every individual's quantity demanded at every single price to get my market demand. Nothing too crazy there, right? So now my market demand curve, it'll still be downward sloping, but the slope will be some combination of all the individuals in my market. Now, here I only have two individuals, right? If I add a third, what's going to happen to my market demand, right? So before I get there, if I were to plot this, I now have the price and not individual quantity demanded, but the entire market quantity demanded. I can just go ahead and plot those points. I still have this downward sloping demand curve. Now, what's going to be some things that we now talk about are going to shift that demand curve? So I kind of already alluded to one of these, but what if I add another person, right? So we're going to start thinking about, I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. So if I just have more buyers, right? That means that at every single price, I don't just have Zoolander and Ken's quantity demanded to add up. I have Zoolander, Ken, and Hansel, right? I have another person, right? So basically, that's going to increase my demand curve. Okay. So, or kind of shift this to the right. So if I think about here, if I add in another person at every price, the quantity demanded is going to be higher. Okay. So the number of buyers is going to shift that demand curve to the right. Another way of thinking about this, just to kind of see me build this out, would be helpful. Anytime we have anything that increases demand, it's going to look like this, right? So here I've got my quantity demand and my price. Here's, say, my original market demand curve. Okay. This was just for two individuals. And remember, every point on this demand curve was what the market quantity demanded was at a specific price. Well, if I just have more people in my economy at every price, I now not only have how much Ken and Zoolander want to buy, but also how much Hansel wants to buy. And that would be true if I was up here at this price. I now have how much Hansel wants to buy. And every single price, I'm now going to have not only two people who want to buy it at that price, but a third person. So I'm going to have the market demand will be higher. Now, I will always kind of discuss this or describe this as a rightward shift in the market demand curve. You can think of it as like an upward shift, right? You're increasing demand. It gets a little more confusing when we talk about supply, which is why I try to kind of keep up or upward and downward shifts. I don't like to use that language. Anytime you see an increase in demand, I would think about that as a rightward shift. And anytime you see a decrease in demand, I would think about that as a leftward shift. You can think about it as up and down. It gets a little bit trickier, like I said, once we get to supply, but whatever kind of is the easiest for you to think about. But this is what we're going to kind of think about as like an increase in demand. Okay. Now, what if we had a decrease in demand, right? Well, a decrease in demand, we said is a leftward shift. Why? Right? So why would this decrease in demand be a leftward shift? Because let's assume population growth is under 2 in the United States. So over time, some of the markets we have might actually see a decrease in the number of buyers. So at every single price, there's going to be a lower quantity demanded, and that's going to be true at every single price. So if we saw a decrease or we saw the demand for a product go down, that's going to look like a leftward shift. So demand increases or shifts to the right, demand decreases, shifts to the left. And I was writing MD here to mean market demand just because we were kind of jumping from individual to market. Typically, From this point on, we're just going to be thinking about the entire demand for a product. So I'll kind of just use kind of capital D to represent that. And then if I'm drawing different demand curves, I'm just numbering them one, two, three, etc. Okay. All right. So talked about the number of buyers. I kind of skipped over this real quick, but I have kind of like a summary. So when we talk about demand shifts, we're going to be thinking about how does this, the relationship, or that you can kind of think about as the slope between price and quantity demanded hasn't changed. It's just that at every single price, there is now a larger amount demanded. So we're going to say, holding everything else constant, we've seen that the demand for this product has shifted. The relationship between price and quantity demanded, the slope hasn't changed, but we've seen a shift in this curve. So, you know, anything that kind of causes these shifts where it increases demand, that was where we saw a shift to the right. And then anything that decreased demand, that was a shift to the left. Another way I always kind of remind people to think about this, if you're shifting towards the 0, 0 point, right, towards that origin, that's a decrease. If I'm shifting away from that point, that's an increase in demand. Okay. So we already talked about the number of buyers that can increase demand. It can also decrease demand if we had a decrease in number of buyers. So some more interesting topics would be, well, what if we see changes in income, right? So if I see changes in income, right, we have two different types of goods, and the effect of that change in income will be different depending on those two goods. So if I have what we call a normal good, this is going to be probably yeah, the most intuitive result. If I have more money for normal goods, I'm going to buy more of them, right? So no matter what the price is, if I just have more money, I'm generally like a millionaire is going to have more, I don't know, cars, more bedrooms in their house. They're going to have, I don't know, more watches, more everything, right? Because they have more. Now, that's kind of true, right? For these normal goods, when we see people have more income, they generally have an increase in that quantity at every price. So clothing, computers, new cars. This is generally most goods we think of. If we have more income, we see an increase in demand. Okay. Now, if it's an inferior good, when we see an increase in income, we tend to see people actually buy less of it, right? Or we see this leftward shift. Okay. So I don't think I've got, yeah. So I'll draw this out for us here just and give you some examples. So if I had a demand curve, and it's telling me that relationship between price and the quantity demanded for this good. If it's a normal good, when I see an increase in income, that means that at every single price, people are going to want to buy more or are willing and able to buy more than they were before. So it looks like we've seen this kind of for a normal good, an increase in income would increase demand. Now, let's say this was something like the example I always use is like ramen noodles, but used cars, um, anything that you can think of that you're only buying out of necessity. So hot dogs. I used to buy a lot more I don't buy hot dogs at all anymore, right? Because to me, they're an inferior good. I'd rather have steak or something else. When I have more money, I'm not forced to buy these cheaper products like ramen noodles, hot dogs, used cars. I'm much more likely to buy a new car. And so if I have more money, and as a result, even if the price of ramen noodles hasn't changed, I buy less of it no matter what the price is. That's telling me that when income is going up, that for inferior products, people are actually going to buy less of them, right? The less money I have, the less likely I am to buy these inferior products, right? I'm more likely to substitute away. We said one of the things kind of driving some of this demand was I would substitute away from these from certain products, right? And so here this is a good example where that substitution effect is really large, right? In the sense of like when I have more money, I am now able to buy better products. I will substitute away from these inferior products, in which case that relationship between income and the entire demand curve for inferior goods ends up being exactly the opposite of what you would usually think. For most goods, when you have more money, people buy more of them. But for these inferior products, when you have more money, you actually see people buy less of them. Okay. Um, some other good examples are like public transportation, right? People don't have to rely on the busing system or things like that. Taxis, they have their own car. So we've got kind of the reverse relationship going on for normal and inferior goods. I always kind of use the example too of like, I haven't bought Natty Ice beer since I was in college, right? As I have more money, it's an inferior product to me. I'm much more likely to buy a slightly more expensive, higher quality beer. Um, and so we kind of have the income effect being the exact opposite for normal and inferior goods. So another demand shifter we can talk about is the price of related goods. So this is going to be two different categories, substitutes and complements. Okay. So substitute goods are going to be goods that we use in replace of each other. So this might be like chicken and beef, or what are some other examples I have here? Could even be just brand differences, right? Pepsi and Coke, a laptop versus a desktop computer, pens versus pencils, things that I use in substitute of each other. Well, the easiest way to think about this is in a brand example. If I don't really care, I don't, to me, all cola tastes the same. I walk into the store. If Coke all of a sudden is $6 for a 12 pack and Pepsi's only $4, which one am I going to buy? Well, I'm going to substitute away from Coke and buy Pepsi. So if the price of Coke goes up, I'm going to buy less of that and substitute more towards what is now relatively cheaper, which is Pepsi. So the price of a related good actually increased the demand for Pepsi for me. Price of Pepsi stayed the same, but because the price of Coke went up, I'm more likely to substitute towards Pepsi now. So I think the idea of substitute goods is usually pretty easy because whatever, if there's a substitute good and it sees a price increase, we're less likely to buy that, more likely to buy the good that is now relatively cheaper. So for a complementary good, this is a little bit weird, but these are going to be goods that are used together. So I always think about like, um, I didn't even put it up here, but like gasoline and gasoline powered vehicles. Well, if the price of gas goes up, am I more or less likely to consider buying, if I'm looking at buying a new car, am I more or less likely to consider buying an electric vehicle or a gas-powered vehicle? Well, if gas is all of a sudden $10 a gallon, I'm less likely to be buying that SUV, right? The complementary good, even though the SUV, the price is still the same, I can't use the SUV without gasoline. So when the price of gasoline, this complementary good goes up, if I demand less of a product because of that, that's telling me that they're complementary goods. Right? Um, and we see that in the data. When the price of gasoline is high, we see gasoline powered car sales are lower, relatively speaking, and electric vehicle cars are higher, right? Um, the other thing I always use is like when batteries, if anything that requires batteries, battery is a complementary good. If the price of batteries all of a sudden is $100, I'm not going to be, buying a clicker to go through my slides during class, right? Because the price of using that clicker now, I can't use it without the batteries. And so it's essentially like when the price of a complementary good goes up, it's just like the price of the good you're using with it goes up, right? If I can't use them independently, then, so um, for substitute goods, the price and the kind of demand for its substitute work in the same direction, right? So, for example, if the price of Pepsi goes up, the demand for Coke is actually going to go up. People are going to substitute away towards Coke. Now, for complementary goods, they work in the opposite direction, right? If the price of gasoline goes up, the complementary good to gasoline, an SUV, the demand for that product is going to go down, right? So we can kind of shorthand this. If you're just kind of wanting to kind of write these, summarize these in one place. So if I do, we could do the income one. So if I have income goes up for a normal good, demand is going to also go up. But if income goes up for an inferior good, demand is going to go down. And then if I think about substitute goods, if the price of some substitute good Y goes up, well, then that means my demand for its substitute. So if this is the price of Coke goes up, the demand for Pepsi will go up because Pepsi is now relatively cheaper. So if it helps for you to think about two goods that make sense to you that are substitutes, so the ones once again, this could be two different brands, this could be, Pepsi Coke brands, this could be clothing brand, whatever you want it to be that makes the most sense to you to kind of remember this relationship, go for it. Same kind of thing. If the price of the substitute good goes down, then the demand for the other product should also go down because this good is becoming relatively cheaper. People stop buying good X. Now, if they're complements, when the price of Y goes up, so this would be like if the price of batteries goes up, the demand for any product that uses batteries is going to go down because I now can't use these unless I spend more money to actually pay for the batteries. And then same kind of idea, if the price of this complementary good goes down, the demand for the other product that's used with it will go up. Okay. So just kind of shorthand, writing this out shorthand with some arrows, um, is one way we can do this. Okay, so I think the only other thing we have, make sure, yeah, are these income and price expectations. So the income expectations really is nothing crazy, right? So the idea of expectations is our current demand will reflect whatever we think is going to happen in the future. So if I think I'm going to have more money in the future, I'd be more likely to buy normal goods today. So for the income expectations, we still have normal and inferior goods, and it's going to work exactly the same. If I expect to have more money in the future, my current demand for normal goods will go up. My current demand for inferior products is going to go down. So for example, when people get a new job, they don't have the money yet, but they know that they're going to have more money in the future. So what do? They take out loans and they're less likely to buy used cars or inferior products today, more likely to get a new car because they think they can pay it off moving forward. So income expectations work the exact same as actually having that income. So nothing real new there. Now, price expectations, this is going to be that if people think that prices are going to be higher in the future, what are they going to want to do today? So if all of a sudden I think that prices are going to be higher tomorrow. What's going to happen to the current demand for the product? Well, I think it's going to be more expensive tomorrow. As long as I have the ability to buy it today, I want to buy it today instead of tomorrow. So if prices are expected to be higher tomorrow, if everyone thinks gas is going to go up by $1 tomorrow, what does everybody do today? They want to buy gas today. And we get these, sometimes shortages caused because people are going to go flood the gas stations thinking that the price is going to go up by $1. Now, same kind of thing. If I think that prices are going to be lower tomorrow, so we see this a lot like in the real estate market. If I think that real estate prices are going to go down, what happens to the current demand for homes? People stop buying as many homes today, right? They're trying to hold out until those prices fall. So it gets a little bit weird because we said with the law of demand, current prices and the current quantity demanded, right? Those two things worked in opposite directions. Future prices and current demand, so if you want to think about this as current demand, they work in the same direction, right? When I think the price is going to be higher tomorrow, right? I don't want to buy it tomorrow. I want to buy it today. And so we kind of see these we're working, kind of moving in the same direction. And then we would still draw them out the same way, right? If I had demand and I saw an increase in demand, right? That would be a rightward shift. And if I saw a decrease in demand, that's going to be a leftward shift. Okay. All right. So I think the only other thing that we haven't touched on, and this is really not a very interesting one because it's just, you can't predict it usually. But if tastes and preferences change, and this is always what people are trying to do, is figure out what tastes and preferences have changed because if all of a sudden people, there's some fad for pet rocks where people are actually going to pay for a pet rock. You know what? Well, I can now charge a much higher price than I was before because everyone's marginal benefit is much higher. I always think of this as like, what's a current trend that people are like, I don't know. Someone was t telling me about these oh, these like the squishmallows, like they're just a stuffed animal, but they can charge a way higher price because it's a fad with kids, and kids have this huge marginal benefit, so, so parents are willing to buy it for them. So anything that's a fad, right, that would shift our tastes and preferences towards something, we could see an increase in demand there. Also, things that kind of fall out of kind of popularity. So like the Atkins diet, like in the 90s was huge. So there was a huge increase in demand for bacon and eggs, but now that's kind of went away. Now we've seen that kind of demand decrease back to kind of what it was before for those kind of high fat, kind of high protein products. So this is just kind of a catch-all category, things that we can't explain using the other things that we talked about: income, expected future income and prices, complementary substitute goods, higher number of buyers. If it's not one of those, we generally think about it's just impacting taste and preferences. Okay. So fidget spinners is somewhat of a more recent one, where all the, people were spending money on these things. The only other one that we haven't talked about, that isn't a part of our catch-all category, is going to be taxes and subsidies. So we're going to hit this a little bit more in module 5 and 6, but we'll touch on it now. So if I tax something, is that going to increase or decrease demand? So it gets kind of weird. We kind of think about this a little bit differently. But let's say if I go into the store and I have to pay $10 for something, let's say the sales tax was 10%. Well, what's the actual price I'm going to have to pay? I'm actually going to have to pay $11, right? So what taxes will do, right, is whatever the current price is, it increases that price. So if I had to pay $20 for something before, now there's a $5 tax on it, maybe a tariff. Now, before I was willing to pay 20, but now if I have to pay a $5 tax as well, in order to pay $20, the price can only be as high as 15. Because now if the price is 15, I'll still end up paying that marginal benefit of 20. So when we're thinking about taxes, whatever my current or my previous demand was before the tax, so this is like my before tax demand. Well, I'm still willing to pay, for example, maybe for that first unit, I'm still willing to pay $20. But now, if the price is $20 plus that $5 tax, I'm going to spend 25. So in order to spend 20, the price that I'm willing to pay is actually only going to be whatever the old price was before the tax minus the value of the tax, right? So at every single point, we are now willing to pay less in terms of the price because we know the total price will actually be the price of the good plus the tax. So taxes will actually cause, so increases in taxes will actually cause us to see decrease in demand. Okay. And then if you give people money for doing something, so if you give them subsidies, well, it's really like if I spend $20, but you're giving me $10 to buy this good, I actually would have paid 20 without being given anything. So if you're going to give me $10 to do it, I actually would have paid $30 here. So with subsidies, we think about if you give people money to do something, that's actually going to increase the demand curve. So if you impose additional taxes on people, right, that demand after the taxes, you're actually going to see a decrease in demand. And that kind of intuitively makes sense. If you tax something, you're essentially increasing the cost at every price. So at every single price, people are willing to buy less. If you give people money to do something, you subsidize it, then at every single price, they'd be willing to buy more. So subsidies will increase demand, taxes will decrease demand. Okay. All right. So, um, and really what that change would be is your new demand would be whatever demand was before minus the tax. Okay. Um, and then you can kind of think about sales tax works in a very similar way, right? If you increase the sales tax enough, you usually don't think about it. But like if you start to go buying a new car, sales tax being different by 1 or 2% ends up being thousands of dollars, right? So you really kind of, might not be able to, buy as nice of a car as you were before because sales tax ends up being a pretty sizable amount. Same, we already talked about subsidies. Another way of thinking about this is taxes, whatever your marginal benefit was before, it's still that, but then minus this additional tax you have to pay. If it's a subsidy and they're giving you money to buy something, your marginal benefit was whatever it was before, plus the additional amount they're giving you. So subsidies will increase your marginal benefit. And we said the demand curve is synonymous with marginal benefit. So if marginal benefit is higher, so is demand. If taxes decrease your marginal benefit, well, if marginal benefit is synonymous with demand, an increase in taxes would then also decrease demand. Okay. So some examples of subsidies that we'll kind of talk about, education subsidies. A lot of you probably have Pell grants or I forget all the different types of grants you get. Food stamps are another good example of subsidies that some people have experience with. There's also like subsidies for like buying an electric vehicle. Sometimes you get like tax write-offs. That's essentially a subsidy. You're kind of being given money to buy an electric vehicle as opposed to a gasoline powered vehicle. So anytime that you're given money to do something, it's increasing your marginal benefit, it's increasing your demand curve. Okay. So here's just kind of a summary of all the things that we talked about, kind of more or fewer consumers, expected income, expected prices, subsidies, taxes, complementary substitute goods, normal inferior goods. All the things that either cause demand to shift right or increase, or all the things that cause demand to shift left or decrease. Okay. So I might kind of chop this up into kind of smaller segments. But that is kind of our first video on demand, kind of get you going. The next one will be over supply and equilibrium, and then we'll think about changes to the equilibrium.